Okay, thank you very much. Yep, so my name's Luke Bell. I'm a lecturer in temperate horticulture at the University of Reading. I'm an early career researcher, so I've spent time previously working in plant breeding companies before transitioning back to academia to do my PhD and postdoc. And I've been a lecturer now since about 2018. So I've worked on kind of minor leafy vegetable crops for much of my career so far. And what I'm going to do is give a bit of an overview of kind of horticultural crops and the impacts that climate change might have upon their production. But I'm also going to focus in particular on potential impacts on quality traits, so things such as nutritional composition and taste and flavor of our crops. So a lot of the time we hear about effects on yields and things like that, which is of course very important, but the effects that climate change might have on these quality traits are sometimes overlooked, I think. And so I'm going to tie in some of my own research on that subject as we go through. So I don't think anyone really needs reminding of the huge challenges that we face in terms of global climate issues. So we've got issues relating to starvation and malnutrition across parts of the world. The issues of malnutrition are ongoing and have been ongoing for many decades in some cases, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. We'll see increasing numbers of climate migrants, either directly or indirectly, forced to move and relocate because conditions are no longer hospitable, or because of conflicts which arise because of wars over water and natural resources. The world will also start experiencing extreme fluctuations in terms of our weather. So we will see intense periods of droughts and floods. And we only have to look to the news in recent years and even this year for examples of that. So for example, the floods in Germany, and also the extreme temperature heat domes that we've seen developing in different parts of the world, like Siberia, and also in parts of Canada, where uncharacteristic temperatures of over 35 degrees centigrade have been seen for long periods of time. And as I mentioned, there'll be increased demands for water. So looking at kind of a more local level, I guess, in terms of the UK and the horticultural production which goes on here, again, we only have to look to the news in recent years to find examples of crops which have had severe losses incurred due to these kind of climate change impacts. So 2019 was a particularly bad year because we had a period of intense a heat wave, which effectively wiped out much of the broccoli and cauliflower productions in parts of the UK. And then later in the year, we had waterlogging problems and harvesting of potatoes. So essentially, farming machinery wasn't able to get into the fields to harvest the potatoes, and many crops were just simply left in the fields to rot. It just wasn't possible to harvest them. So all of this incurs a huge amount of waste, and also obviously reducing outputs for growers. And it's going to be a real challenge going forward to develop new varieties which are capable of withstanding these types of conditions. So this is a recent or relatively recent farmer survey that I came across. So it was a survey which was done by Farmers Weekly, and I just found it interesting that farmers and growers are able to quantify these impacts which are sort of happening on their farms on a day-to-day and week-by-week, month-by-month basis. So the respondents to this, so this is encompassing all farms in the UK, all the respondents on average reported losses incurred due to climate-related factors of about nearly £52,000 a year, which is a lot of money. And farmers are increasingly being asked to do more with less. So facing all of these challenges to do with the extremes of the environment, they're still being asked to produce more and more higher yields and output. But increasingly with the climate change factors, yields are inevitably going to be lower in a lot of cases in some years, and establishment of crops is going to be more difficult as conditions become less favorable. So 27% of growers have experienced flooding at some point in the last 10 years, 56% have experienced extreme rainfall, 25% of experienced extreme cold, and 2018 and 19 were highlighted in the survey as being quite bad years for these extremes, fluctuating from one to the other. I mentioned before about malnutrition, so thinking again more globally. So there's this concept known as hidden hunger. So it's actually possible to be relatively well fed but still be malnourished, and that's because you can have quite high amounts of carbohydrates in the diet, which might be provided by staple crops such as rice. However, rice grain crops generally aren't as rich in vitamins and minerals as horticultural fruits and vegetables are. So hence you can see development of malnutrition even where food supply isn't necessarily a huge problem, but these malnutritions can develop over time. So yeah, fruits like tomatoes and even lettuces have concentrations of phytochemicals within them that aren't present in grains, or if they are present, they're in very low amounts. And part of the processing of rice, for example, removes a lot of the nutritional composition from it when they're dehusked. So a lot of the nutrients are contained within that bran layer of the rice, which is removed. So fruits and vegetables are, a rich source of nutrients and health beneficial secondary metabolites. So one of the best researched of these is polyphenols. So they've been shown to improve cardiovascular health and cognitive health, for example. And I'm going to talk a little bit about other secondary metabolites which are present in brassica crops in a bit. But it's arguable that horticultural crops are more vulnerable to climate change than grain crops and cereal crops, because they've not had the level of investment that those crops have had. So there are drought and waterlogging resistant cereal cultivars. However, it's not so commonplace to find those in horticultural crops. So what are the types of climate factors and sort of secondary climate factors that are going to be so problematic for horticultural crops going forward? So we have light, so obviously light intensity and quality and duration. The duration is not necessarily going to change as a result of climate change, but definitely the intensity. So if you have more cloudless days, for example, the intensity of the sunshine could be greater. Of course, one of the key factors associated with climate change is increasing temperatures globally. So trying to limit that to 1.5 degrees globally is going to be a big challenge, but it could conceivably be much higher than that. And again, it's not necessarily just about the rising temperatures themselves, but also those extreme fluctuations between extreme heat and extreme cold in different times of the year in different places across the world. And I've mentioned water status and irrigation and in times of drought. So making sure that we've got enough water to supply plants with the required water is going to be essential. So that example of the brassicas that I gave in the UK, much of the irrigation water kind of ran out, and so it had to be rationed, but unfortunately that wasn't enough to rescue the crops. So we need much more infrastructure in place to ensure that there's adequate water resources to supply the crops with what they need. And I mentioned the opposite of that, where you have waterlogging at different points in the year, which again can be as devastating as a drought. Then also we have changes in biotic factors, so things like pests, their numbers, and so with shifts in climate, we might see new pests arising in places where they didn't before, and so it's conceivable that some pests might start attacking in countries where previously they had no presence, and so crops there could be especially vulnerable to these new pests which come along. And with that, pests often bring with them viruses and bacterial infections, and also fungal diseases might develop as a result of changes in relative humidity within crops. So we could get increased disease burdens as a result of changes in climate. And so going forward, plant breeders and researchers have to find ways of adapting our fruits and vegetables for these extreme changes in the environment. And it's very difficult from a breeding perspective, as it typically takes many years or even decades to produce a new variety that comes to market. So from inception to the market delivery can often take around about 10 years, 20 years. And the environments are changing faster than the breeders can actually keep up with. So new methods which are coming along to try and enhance and speed up that process have been developed. So it started with marker-assisted selection, for example, in the late 80s and 1990s, which has moved now into genomic selection, and also more recently CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology. So these methods are potentially very helpful for speeding up this process, but it's by no means a silver bullet, because again, CRISPR-Cas9 takes years of development. It can't just be implemented immediately in any given crop. There is going to be a lag in terms of the when we see these types of crops coming to market. And potatoes in this slide is actually quite a good example of a crop which has seen relatively little change in terms of its genetic diversity over the last 100 years. Many of the cultivars and varieties which are grown today, they're decades old, or in some cases even over 100 years old, and they're still being cultivated. So they're especially vulnerable to changes in the environment, drought stress, and also any new pests and diseases which might come along. So why are horticultural crops so vulnerable to climate change? Well, a lot of it is kind of inherent to the process of domestication. So virtually all fruits and vegetables we see on our supermarket shelves day to day are domesticated. They're not products of nature, they're products of human selection. So we've selected them for nice shape, color, taste, flavor, yields, obviously, but very few of these actually resemble their wild relatives or ancestral species. And this process is inherently reduces crop diversity, and therefore limits the amount of inherent ability the crops have to adapt to these fluctuations and changes we're seeing in our environment. So just to put that in kind of like a visual terms, you can imagine it as being a bit of a filter from one kind of period of time to another. So we have our original kind of wild progenitor species, many hundreds or even thousands of years ago, which might have been selected by humans for cultivation. And through the process of domestication, they might have been selected for those different traits that I've mentioned. But during that selection process, inherently, some genetic diversity will be lost. And then when we get to our modern varieties, they have a fraction of the genetic diversity that those original and still extant wild species have. So it's very important that we are able to go back to those original sources of genetic diversity and to improve our current crops so that they can cope with the environmental changes which are coming our way. So this slide is just a picture of some examples of different potato cultivars and species which are found in Peru. So you can see there's a huge range of diversity in terms of shape, size, and color, but they'll also vary in terms of their ability to tolerate different climatic conditions. And you get different cultivars which are adapted to different microclimates. So they will have genetic variants which could be of use more widely to widely cultivated crops. So having access to this genetic diversity is really important, and it's important that we are able to preserve it and catalog it and understand it, so that we can use those to help improve things like disease resistance, stress tolerance, and also again, what I'm interested in is nutritional quality and taste and flavor quality. So crops lacking this genetic diversity are inherently vulnerable to pests and diseases and environmental change. So a good example of a crop which has kind of been heavily diversified according to and selected by humans is mustard. And wild mustard has given rise to all of these different types of crops. So Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, cauliflower, broccoli, and several others. And so they've all been selected by humans for different parts of the plant over the course of human history. And you'll never find a wild broccoli or a wild kohlrabi. They don't exist in nature. They've been bred and selected by us for all the purposes of farming and consumption. And so inherently they've kind of lost a lot of their genetic diversity, but there are wild relatives and wild species which we can tap into for improved traits. So, for example, wild mustards are found all over the Mediterranean. They're quite hardy and drought tolerant. Typically, they can be found growing on the sides of cliffs in very sort of dry places. So they do have this inherent adaptability within the gene pool for growing in very dry conditions, for example, very hot conditions. But modern cultivars, have kind of lost this ability. So it's important that we're able to go back and crossbreed different varieties and reintroduce those traits into our modern cultivars. And also, wild relatives have desirable traits for nutritional content. So the example I've given here is of Brassica villosa, which is a wild species which has been interbred with broccoli, modern broccoli, to develop the so-called super broccoli, which was developed by Richard Meisen at the John Innes Centre. So that super broccoli contains huge quantities, or produces huge quantities, of a compound called sulforaphane, which is noted for its anti-cancer properties and anti-neurodegenerative properties. So it's these compounds I'm going to talk about, and which I've kind of focused on it as part of my research as well. So how is quality and nutritional composition affected by climate? So the crop that I've mostly worked on is called salad rocket. Its Latin name is Eruca sativa. It also contains sulforaphane and health beneficial compounds. It's quite a popular leafy vegetable around the world. And part of my research during my PhD was working with a breeding company to try and develop new cultivars of salad rocket. And salad rocket's interesting because it contains those the similar compounds to other brassicas, like broccoli. So the plants contain compounds called glucosinolates, which are then broken down by an enzyme to produce isothiocyanates. So one of those is sulforaphane. So that's also present in salad rocket. So part of my PhD was to screen these different cultivars for these enhanced nutritional traits. So not only do the compounds themselves have nutritional properties, but they also give rise to taste and flavor, as well as a whole plethora of different compounds which are present within the leaves. So you have things like amino acids and sugars, and the kind of building blocks of and materials of the plant, but also defensive compounds such as green leaf volatiles, polyphenols, and the glucosinolates, which are primarily defensive compounds. And those are then broken down into the isothiocyanates, which are very bitter, sulfurous, and pungent, and gives a characteristic taste of rocket and many other different types of brassica as well. So just as a few examples here, so if anyone really hates Brussels sprouts and find them really bitter, or find them very sulfurous and eggy and unpleasant, well, it's these compounds which give rise to those unpleasant kind of tastes and flavors. But they're also present in other crops such as turnips, wasabi, and horseradish. So the very pungent sensations you get from horseradish and wasabi, that's due to isothiocyanates. And so this is the reaction here you can see, where the glucosinolates are broken down, and they can form a whole host of different products, but it's isothiocyanates which are of most interest for health properties. So as I said, these give rise to many different tastes and flavors, but they're most noted for these bitter and pungent tastes and flavors. And as I've mentioned, they have benefits for human health and have been demonstrated to improve the composition of the gut microbiome as well. But what does any of this have to do with climate, and how might these compounds be affected by climate change? Well, one of the biggest production areas of rocket, and also many other crops which are imported into the UK, come from parts of the Mediterranean, countries like Italy and also Spain. And so, a future UK climate might look something, in the most extreme scenarios, might look a little bit more like Italy, current Italian kind of Mediterranean conditions, and the current kind of oceanic climate that we have at the moment. So as you can see in these COP and climate types, the different types of climates which are present in Italy are quite dry and hot during the summers. So that's quite an ideal environment for growing salad rocket, because that's where it originates from. So it's quite well adapted to those climates. So conceivably, this particular crop might be well adapted to the UK climate in future. However, other brassica crops might not be. So some of my research has looked at how climate and particularly temperature influences the abundance of these health beneficial isothiocyanates. So this is an experiment we did a few years ago, where we grew plants at different temperatures, so 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. And we found that 40 degrees centigrade and 30 degrees centigrade in the second cut produced significantly more isothiocyanates. So under a warmer climate, potentially, there might be more production of these health beneficial compounds. But this, as I said, was a controlled environment study. The 40 degrees C condition might seem a little bit extreme, but in parts of Italy, it's quite common for there to be periods where temperatures can get to as high as 40 degrees or even higher. And in a lot of productions, they're grown under polytunnels. So the temperature within the tunnels can actually be several degrees higher than the outside ambient temperatures. So these could be reflective of future climate conditions in that country. So I also did field trials comparing Italian-grown rocket with UK-grown. So if we look at glucosinolate content, you can see there's a big difference between the two countries. So Italian-grown rocket typically produces many times more glucosinolates than UK-grown. And when we look at those breakdown products, the isothiocyanates, even though you've got a relatively large pool of glucosinolates in the UK-grown material, if I just flip back, there is some there, but that doesn't translate into these health beneficial compounds. So the increased temperatures in the Italian environment is conducive to a higher activity of the enzyme, which breaks down glucosinolates, and so therefore produces much more of the isothiocyanates. You might think that, well, that sounds like a benefit of climate change, but however, people who eat crops with high glucosinolates and high isothiocyanates, and also where those same crops have a very low sugar concentration, as you can see here, the Italian grown crop had very low sugars compared to the UK. That actually makes them less desirable to eat. So the increase in these isothiocyanates might be beneficial for health, but people aren't going to eat those crops if they taste really bitter and really hot and pungent. So those are negative consequences potentially of climate change, where we might see significant differences and changes in the taste and flavors of the crops. So not just rocket, but it might also extend to other crops such as brassicas and maybe even fruit crops as well. So why is it so difficult to breed and adapt varieties for improved nutritional traits, particularly under climate change? Well, these traits are often polygenic, and they're highly sensitive to environmental changes. So it's very hard to integrate all of those different genes and beneficial alleles into a single cultivar. It can take decades of crossing and test productions to produce something that's stable across many different environments. What we might see in future is cultivars adapted for very specific environments, so very hot environments, very dry environments. But again, that will be problematic if there's an extreme weather event and you all of a sudden get cold temperatures or there's flooding. The nutrition, there tends to be a trade-off for improved nutritional quality. So if a plant is producing high concentrations of different beneficial compounds, whether it's isothiocyanates or vitamins as well, that metabolic energy is being put into the production of these secondary metabolites, and not necessarily into growth of the plant. So they might be very nutritionally good, but they might not yield as much as other cultivars which have been bred exclusively for yield. And also for most horticultural species, the long-term effects of increased atmospheric carbon dioxide is virtually unknown. I mean, there's a few studies which have been done in Arabidopsis and also in cereal crops as well, but in terms of horticultural crops, there's still quite a big gap in what's known in the literature about how atmospheric carbon dioxide is going to affect nutritional composition, taste and flavor. There are, however, as I mentioned, technologies which can be used for the implementation of improved breeding of horticultural crops. So it's becoming more and more commonplace in breeding programs to use genetic technology and genetic markers. And now many more genomes are being sequenced. So there are vast reserves of data potentially for identifying beneficial alleles, which could be integrated into breeding programs. And there are huge opportunities for using genome editing techniques such as CRISPR-Cas9. An example of one particular crop which has been genetically engineered to produce high concentrations of a health beneficial compound is the so-called blue or purple tomato. So this contains a gene from snapdragon, and it's resulted from enhanced production of anthocyanins, which are common in blueberries and blackberries, for example. And there's also examples where tomatoes have been engineered to produce isoflavones, which again have health benefits in terms of anti-cancer properties. So genome sequencing is becoming more and more commonplace, as I said, and cheaper. And this is just a list of a few of the crops which have now had their genome sequenced. So there's the potential to tap into that genetic diversity now and identify new lines which might help modern cultivars adapt to these future extreme climate conditions. Metabolomics is a bit of a bottleneck, so this can be kind of tied into the genomics. So it's quite important that you're able to well characterize the kind of nutritional components of a crop. So you can associate the production of different metabolites with different genes in the genome. However, it's very difficult and time consuming to do that to a high level and high quality. So this is still a bit of a bottleneck, and it is still quite expensive. So while the cost of genome sequencing is rapidly coming down, high throughput metabolomics of entire plant populations isn't really coming down at the same kind of pace. So as part of my work, it was possible for us to sequence the genome of rocket. So we published a paper a couple of years ago looking at differences between cultivars of rocket and gene expression related to these metabolites. But we had the benefit of having some quite some quite high level of funding behind us, so provided by companies like Back4 and Elsom Seeds. And so we obtained funding from a PhD and postdoc from BBSRC, but now a lot of these funding mechanisms have kind of been reduced or fallen away over time. So it's becoming more difficult to do this type of research and develop these kinds of genetic resources. And I'm just going to kind of finish on a bit of a funding related aspect in that in the UK, we currently have this kind of model where it's kind of like a bicycle model where fundamental research feeds into strategic research and applied research and industry application. However, we've seen in recent earlier this year that funding from organisations such as the AHDB have been withdrawn now. So there's this big gap in terms of what funds the transition between that basic technology research through into commercialization and development and implementation. So that is now quite a big loss for the UK horticulture sector, and it's not clear at the moment how that shortfall in funding is going to be made up. And it's quite concerning that there are potential advances being made in fundamental research which aren't then going to be translated into real world kind of applications. So I and others formed a consortium to kind of try and address this and find out what the government's plans are for funding of horticulture in the UK. I don't want to get too political or anything like that, but just suffice it to say that there does need to be some kind of replacement now in infrastructure and expertise going forward to facilitate that knowledge exchange between, as I say, basic research and then industry implementation. Okay, so I'll just finish there and just say thanks to all of my collaborators who helped along the way with the different aspects of the rocket breeding work. So my supervisor, Carol Weststaff at Reading, and Lisa Methven were my old PhD supervisors, and everybody else who's helped. Big thanks to them. And thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks very much, Luke. You couldn't. I was going to say you can't go a presentation without making the rocket science.
Yeah, exactly. It's trademark now.
Exactly. That's great. So, and a good point well made about the HDB funding. Obviously, the lack of that horticultural support could be really significant.
Yeah.
There is a new DEFRA scheme that has been announced, but it's unclear how well that will bridge that gap. It seems to be quite farmer based, that one, so we will see how that goes. Okay, so we got a few questions come in actually, so both in the Q&A and the chat. So first of all, anonymous question about the Italian and the UK rocket lines. So were both the Italian and UK rockets cultivated outdoors or indoors, i.e. were they under similar conditions?
Yep. So the different production methods, vary according to growing location. So in the UK, it's all open field production. So UK rocket production is limited pretty much between about April and September. It's all done outdoors, predominantly on the south coast, so places like Dorset and Kent. Whereas in Italy, it's common and pretty much exclusively cultivated under polytunnel or glass. So the experiment we did was kind of reflective of those industry practices as well. So it wasn't controlled; they weren't both grown out in open field, but we tried to accommodate those, what happens in the real world, if you like, in terms of their production.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me follow on from that. A question from Wendy in the chat, and she asks: is there a significant difference between outdoor versus polytunnel production in relation to nutritional composition?
It hasn't been studied that well in rocket specifically, but I mean, we do see big differences. Like, for example, when we grow the plants in controlled environment conditions and then compare them to the outdoor conditions, whether that's polytunnel or open field. So it's very difficult to replicate those field conditions in controlled environments. That's why we try to supplement the controlled environment studies with these field experiments to see just how they varied. But I haven't done that explicit comparison between glasshouse and field, for example.
Okay. So a question from Ian. Ian asks, is the low sugar content of the Italian rocket that you mentioned really a problem? Is this the problem? Why not just eat it mixed with something sweeter like tomato? Isn't this what they do anyway? Yeah,
that's true. So I guess there's a bit of a sweet spot. So I mean, Italian grown rocket, it has low sugar content, and people do prefer a little bit of kind of pungency in the leaves, but there's a certain threshold where it becomes undesirable. So the risk is that if they're not accumulating enough sugars, then they might be really bitter. But one of the things which is commonly done in salads, as you say, is eat with other things to add that sugar back in from other fruits and vegetables. And another thing also is the addition of oil. So Italians like to add olive oil to things. So isothiocyanates are quite soluble in oils. So a lot of the time, those really pungent volatiles can be kind of soaked up by the oil, and you get a reduction in the intensity of those kinds of those tastes and flavors. So that's quite specific to rocket. But other fruits, other vegetables which contain the glycosinolates like broccoli and things like that. It's a little bit the kinds of foods you'd eat broccoli with are quite different from what you'd eat the salad crops with. So your traditional kind of Sunday lunch with broccoli and cauliflower and stuff. It's a bit harder to introduce those sugars back in there. So hence why people have developed this aversion to the bitter type flavors which are present in Brussels sprouts and things.
You're making me angry. I can actually, when I'm looking out the window, I've got some rocket growing in my garden out there. So I think I'm going to have a little for my lunch. So, okay, so we got a few more questions. A question, maybe a bit more of a speculative one from Javier. He asks, do you think that novel foods could be integrated into the market, such as algae or duckweed? What's your opinion on
that? I don't know. That's a little bit outside my experience with that. But I think there's definitely scope for developing novel crops in general, novel foods. I mean, we're seeing increases, for example, in alternative protein sources, whether that's being plant-derived protein or even insect proteins. So we're seeing a lot of new kind of initiatives for developing alternative sources for a lot of our food. So I don't see any reason why that couldn't also extend to horticultural crops. I mean, some are more common in parts of the world than others. But I mean, if you go back about 30 years ago, rocket wasn't really consumed anywhere except the kind of Mediterranean. But now it's kind of ubiquitous everywhere. You can get it anywhere in the world. So yeah, I think there's definitely scope for that development of new products, but it takes time. It's taken 30 years for rocket, and it'll probably take 20 years for any new products which are currently being developed. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a critical importance, is that those projects which could have real benefits in terms of climate sustainability are kind of accelerated, because we need them now, not 30 years down the road.
Exactly, indeed. So a slightly more specific question. This is from Elaine. So Elaine's actually, I think, in New Zealand. So
oh, wow, cool.
Thanks very much for staying up, I guess that would be.
Yeah.
Okay, so and she asked a question about if you have any insight about the impacts of the soil microbiome on horticultural crops and the nutritional composition of that. She mentions that she's heard about some mycorrhizal fungi that can improve phenolics or flavonoids in crops. Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've not researched it specifically myself, but I know of different experiments and examples which have kind of gone on in relation to that. So I mean, I can talk about like the kind of relationship with brassica plants, because I mean that's kind of what I specialised in, and it does seem that there are sort of symbiotic relationships between the plants and the soil microbial composition. So there are certain types of microbe in the soil, for example, which are able to metabolize glucosinolate compounds and utilize them. So they seem to have developed this relationship, and you can get this dysbiosis in the soil, where perhaps certain beneficial microbes for the plants aren't present or have been removed, and you get this disequilibrium. I'm not quite sure how it might affect yields, but certainly in terms of defensive compounds, it does seem that a lot of the presence of not only soil microbes, but also microbes which are present on the leaves do have a relationship with the plants and are able to sort of stimulate production of these, as you say, polyphenols and glucosinolates. So it's not clear whether this is an adaptation for defense, or whether it's a kind of signaling mechanism that the microbes have kind of adopted to get the plant to produce what they want, if you see what I mean. But it does seem like there is this kind of relationship there, and I think it's going forward, and the kind of diagnosis of soil health and looking at the relationship between microbes and plants is going to be really key for optimizing nutrition. Yeah,
absolutely. There's plenty of questions. It's good. It's a very engaged audience today. So cool. We've got a few more minutes, so we'll ask a few more if you don't mind. Yeah, so a question from Alan. He says a couple of years ago we witnessed a lettuce crop stressed by high 20-degree temperatures, 12 degrees Celsius temperatures, despite 2 waterings per day. So does irrigation really help in high temperature situations, do you think?
Well, from research I've done in potato crops, I know it's not lettuce, but just using an example I can relate to, a lot of the response to irrigation does seem to be cultivar specific. So, I mean, it's also the case for brassicas. I mean, there will be genetic sort of adaptation to water utilization. So it's a variable trait, the same as any other kind of environmental response trait. So it may be that certain cultivars are maladapted to those extremes that we're going to see in the future. I think part of it, as I mentioned, is understanding which, because there are cultivars out there which can tolerate these things. It's just a question of finding them and then applying them in the right situation. So I don't know exactly the mechanism by which that particular lettuce crop could conceivably have been stressed by, despite the fact there's plentiful water, but it might be that it was just maladapted to or has a higher transpiration rate than, say, if a different cultivar had been used in that field, which would have wouldn't have found the conditions as stressful. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions which are a bit more general about the impacts of climate change. So let me try and Tracy those with just asking, maybe from a UK perspective, which crops do you think are most vulnerable? So the crops that we grow, if we give it a UK perspective, which crops are most vulnerable to climate changes as we're going to see them?
Yeah, well, I might be biased, but I think brassicas, because they're very intolerant of high temperatures, which inhibit proper development, especially without adequate irrigation. And it also affects could conceivably affect the vernalization of crops like cauliflower and broccoli going forward. So they do have that cold requirement in order to initiate flowering. So if the cultivar hasn't been selected to have that high temperature vernalization, then it could be conceivable that you get very irregular flowering and irregular yields of those types of crops. And as we've seen from those kind of news stories in the past, particularly parts of Lincolnshire, which generally have a bit less rainfall than other parts of the country. There are specific regions within the UK where it could be quite problematic going forward, because it's very difficult when you've got a finite amount of irrigation water and it's got to stretch over a whole crop cycle. And you're not getting that extra rainfall to top it up. So I think brassicas definitely are quite vulnerable. Also potatoes. Again, I might be biased, but they're very susceptible to drought at certain points of the life cycle. So even though droughts probably might not wipe out an entire crop of potatoes, it's going to affect tuber development and tuber yields. So if you're having deficit of water at the kind of tuber formation and development phase of the growth cycle, then that's going to decrease yields quite a lot. Yeah, so this would be my two.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, just to see if we get a shift in the location where things are grown, but then the arable plants are grown in the UK out in the east because there's a lot of space there, less space as you go more north.
Exactly.
Reasonable around. So okay, so I think we're going to leave it there. So 45 minutes is up. So I think we've had a really nice session to kick off this webinar series. So thank you very much, Luke, for giving the presentation. And thanks to everyone who attended. So we had a nice number, over 100 attendees, so that's really great. And so, as I said, the next one is on Friday. Remember the time change at 3 o'clock. With Julie Law will be talking about her work on the extremely well-funded harnessing plants project in the US. So please come along to that. But in the meantime, let me thank everyone for attending, and thanks very much, Luke, for your presentation. It's great.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.